On the morning of August 16, 1780, in a forest of longleaf pines about 5 miles north of Camden, South Carolina, an army that no longer had the strength to stand was ordered to fight. 1,200 of them were Continental regulars, the hardest, best drilled infantry the young United States possessed, the Maryland and Delaware lines, men who had fought at Brooklyn and Brandywine and Monmouth. Around them stood nearly 3,000 militia who had never seen a battle. By the time the sun was fully up, more than 2,000 of those men would throw down their muskets without firing a shot. Within weeks, when the survivors finally gathered at a rallying point in North Carolina and were counted, the elite vanguard that had marched south numbering 1,200 had been reduced to roughly 700. 1,200 marched in, 700 came back. Think about that number for a moment, because it is the spine of this entire story. Out of a combined force of more than 4,000 men, the Army of the American Southern Department was not defeated at Camden. It was erased. And here is the detail that makes it one of the strangest catastrophes in the history of the Revolution. The enemy that destroyed this army did far less damage than the man commanding it. We tend to imagine that battles are won and lost in the moment the lines collide, by courage, by the angle of a charge, by the nerve of men under fire. Sometimes they are. But Camden is the other kind of battle. Camden was lost in the weeks before anyone fired a shot. It was lost on a barren road through the pine barrens. It was lost over a ration of molasses. It was lost in a single stubborn decision by a famous general who would not listen. By the time the British appeared out of the dark, the outcome had, in every way that mattered, already been decided. Across this video, working only from the documented record, primarily the detailed account left by Colonel Otho Holland Williams, who was there, who survived, and who wrote it all down, I'm going to reconstruct exactly how an army of over 4,000 was dismantled in less than an hour. You'll understand why a man celebrated as the hero of Saratoga marched his soldiers deliberately into a wasteland his own officers begged him to avoid. You'll learn why those soldiers went into the most important battle of the Southern War already, sick, broken not by British muskets but by green corn, unripe peaches, and a substitute for rum that turned the night before the battle into an epidemic. You'll see how a doctrine so old and so respected that both generals followed it without question guaranteed that the weakest American troops would stand directly in front of the deadliest British regiments on the continent. You'll watch two armies march toward each other in the dark on the same road, at the same hour, neither one knowing the other was there. And you'll meet a 59-year-old Bavarian giant who took 11 wounds and would not fall, while the general who outranked him rode 60 miles in the opposite direction on the fastest horse in the army. This is not a story about bad luck. There was no decisive accident, no freak collapse of fortune. Camden is a study in how an army can be defeated by its own command before it ever meets the enemy, and how, paradoxically, that very disaster cleared the ground for the victory that would end the war. If you want more deep, source-driven reconstructions of the battles that actually decided history, take a second now and hit subscribe. Then let us step back to the spring of 1780, to the moment the entire war turned south. By 1780, the revolution in the North had ground to a stalemate. 5 years of war had taught the British High Command a hard lesson. They could win battles around New York and Philadelphia all day long and still not break the rebellion. So they changed the map. They looked south. The plan had a name, the Southern Strategy, and on paper it was elegant. The Carolinas and Georgia were rich in exactly what the rebellion lived on: tobacco, rice, indigo, the agricultural wealth that funded the war. The South was also believed, by British planners, to be full of loyal subjects only waiting for the king's army to arrive so they could rise up against their rebel neighbors. Capture the great southern ports, the thinking went, arm the loyalists, peel the southern colonies away from the Union one by one, and the whole structure of the rebellion would crack from the bottom up. And at first, it worked spectacularly. On the 12th of May, 1780, after a long siege, the city of Charleston, South Carolina, surrendered to General Sir Henry Clinton. It is difficult to overstate what a calamity this was for the American cause. When Major General Benjamin Lincoln laid down his arms, he surrendered more than 5,000 troops, and among them roughly 2,500 trained Continental soldiers, including much of the Virginia Continental Line and other vital units. It remains the single largest surrender of American forces in the entire war. In one stroke, the Continental Army's Southern Department was wiped from the strategic map. For the men taken at Charleston, Surrender was only the beginning of the ordeal. They were packed onto prison ships in the suffocating heat of a Carolina summer, where disease and starvation did what British muskets had not. Of the thousands captured, only a fraction lived to be exchanged. This was the cost of the South's first great defeat, and it was the prologue to its second. With Charleston taken, Clinton sailed back to New York and handed the Southern theater to his second-in-command, Lieutenant General Charles, Lord Cornwallis. Cornwallis was given an enormous task: secure the interior of South Carolina, crush whatever resistance remained, and prepare to drive north into North Carolina and beyond. To hold a region that vast, he could not rely on field armies alone. He built a web of fortified outposts at the river crossings and crossroads that controlled movement through the backcountry. The most important knot in that web was a town called Camden. Camden sat near the watery river, and it mattered for a single decisive reason: logistics. It was the depot, the warehouse, the beating heart of British supply between the coast and the interior. Whatever moved from the wealth of Charleston into the backcountry moved through Camden. Cornwallis understood its value, and before he returned to the coast to manage the colony's affairs, he installed a capable young officer, Lord Francis Rawdon, as district commander, with a garrison of around 700 men, British regulars and loyalist provincial troops. From Camden, that garrison's reach extended out along the rivers, to Rocky Mount, to Hanging Rock, to the Cheraw Hills. But here is what the maps in London did not show. British control of South Carolina was an illusion stretched thin over a countryside that was rising, in fury. The surrender of an army is not the surrender of a people. As British regulars and vengeful loyalist militias spread across the state, they lit a fire under a brutal, irregular civil war. Out of the swamps in the backcountry came the partisan commanders whose names would become legend: Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock; Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox; Andrew Pickens. They led bands of mounted irregulars who struck supply trains and isolated posts and then vanished before the regulars could form up. By the first week of August 1780, Cornwallis's forces had absorbed more than a dozen of these partisan attacks and taken close to 500 casualties. The British held the ground their boots stood on. The countryside, increasingly, belonged to the insurgency. It is worth pausing on what kind of war this had become, because the Camden campaign did not happen in a clean contest of uniformed armies. The southern backcountry in 1780 had dissolved into something closer to a blood feud, neighbor against neighbor, patriot against loyalist, with the formal British and American forces riding through a landscape already soaked in private vengeance. Farms were burned by both sides. Men were hanged from their own trees for the crime of supporting the wrong cause. The line between soldier and civilian, between war and murder, had largely worn away. This was the country the Grand Army would have to march through, and it explains why the population along Gates's chosen route mattered so much. In a war like this, a hostile population was not a passive inconvenience. It was an active enemy, watching your column, counting your men, and carrying word of your movements to the British. And one name above all had come to embody the ferocity of the Southern War: Banastra Tarleton. Earlier that same summer, at a place called the Waxhaws, Tarleton's British Legion had run down a force of Virginia Continentals. And what happened there, whatever the precise truth of it, and the accounts are disputed, entered Patriot memory as a massacre, as the slaughter of men trying to surrender. The phrase Tarleton's Quarter, meaning no quarter at all, became a rallying cry across the Carolinas. We will meet Tarleton again twice in this story, once in the dark before the battle, and once in the days after, and both times he arrives as the sharp edge of British power in the South. The patriots who heard his legion was on the field did not need to be told what it meant. This was the situation that finally moved Philadelphia to act. A guerrilla war, however fierce, cannot by itself drive a professional army out of a region. The partisans could bleed Cornwallis, they could not beat him. To do that, the rebellion needed a conventional force back in the field, an army large enough to threaten his outposts, to draw his regulars into open battle, and to give the militia bands something to anchor to. And so, even before Charleston's fall was confirmed, the Continental Congress and George Washington began scrambling to build a new army for the South. Out of almost nothing, that army is the one that marched to Camden. To understand how it died, you have to understand who its soldiers were, because they deserved a far better fate than the one they were handed. On the 16th of April, 1780, a column of some of the finest infantry in the Continental establishment marched out of their winter quarters at Morristown, New Jersey, and turned south. They were acting on Washington's urgent orders, racing to save a Southern department that, unknown to them, was about to collapse entirely. At their core were the 1st and 2nd Maryland Brigades, the Delaware Regiment, and a train of field artillery. About 1,400 regulars in all. These were not ordinary soldiers, and it matters that we say so plainly, because almost everything that followed was a waste of exactly what made them extraordinary. The men of Maryland, the old line, had earned a reputation in blood. 4 years earlier, at the Battle of Brooklyn in 1776, a detachment of roughly 400 Marylanders had thrown themselves again and again at an overwhelming British force, making charge after charge, 7 of them by the traditional count, to hold open an escape route while Washington's trapped army slipped away. They were sacrificing themselves on purpose, and they knew it. Washington is said to have watched them and grieved. The state's nickname, the Old Line State, is generally traced to those men in that day. The Delaware Regiment was cut from the same cloth, disciplined, steady, recognizable in their distinctive blue coats, and rated by many as among the best light infantry in the world at that time. Through the northern campaigns, they had fought with a tenacity that veteran officers spoke of with something close to reverence. These were the troops now marching south. This was the instrument Washington was sending to rebuild the war in the Carolinas. Linger for a moment on what those men had already done, because it sharpens the waste that was coming. At Brooklyn in the late summer of 1776, the first great battle after independence was declared. Washington's army had been outmaneuvered and very nearly trapped against the East River, with the entire cause balanced on whether it could escape. A few hundred Marylanders were thrown into the gap to buy time. They did it the hard way, hurling themselves at a far larger British force dug in around a stone house, charging again and again into massed fire, by tradition something like 7 times, knowing that most of them would not come back, so that the rest of the army could slip away across the water. It worked. Washington's army survived to fight another day, and the Revolution survived with it. The cost was paid almost entirely by those Marylanders, and it is largely from that morning that Maryland carries the name the Old Line State to this day. This is the pedigree of the regulars Gates inherited. They were not green levies. They were the men who had already saved the army once with their own bodies. The most reliable infantry the United States possessed. The hard professional core around which everything else was supposed to form. An army has only so many units like that. Units you can trust to hold when everything is coming apart. To spend them carelessly is one of the worst sins a commander can commit, because they cannot be quickly replaced. Their discipline is the work of years, and Camden, in the end, is in large part the story of that priceless instrument being marched into ruin by a man who never seemed to understand what he was holding. And the man chosen to lead them was, in many ways, the moral center of this entire story. His name was Johann Baron de Kalb, a Bavarian-born officer 59 years old, with a long career in European service behind him. De Kalb was a physical giant by the standards of his age, standing well over 6 feet, broad and powerful, with a face his aides described as mixing good humor with a hard, shrewd tactical intelligence. He was, by every surviving account, exactly the kind of man you would want at the head of an army about to suffer. He lived like a Spartan. He drank no alcohol at all, preferring plain bread and water. And on the march, when most generals of his rank rode comfortably on horseback, de Kalb routinely walked 20, 30 miles in a day on his own feet in the dust alongside the soldiers he commanded. The men knew this. It is the kind of thing soldiers always know about a general, and it bought him a loyalty that other commanders never earned. His road to that pine forest in South Carolina had been a long and improbable one. De Kalb was not born a baron at all. The title and the nobility were, by most accounts, an embellishment he had adopted earlier in life to open doors in a European military world that cared enormously about birth. He had risen instead the way few men of his origins could, on raw ability, through decades of hard service in the French army, surviving the great European wars of the 18th century, and earning a reputation as a serious, professional soldier. He had even crossed the Atlantic once before the Revolution, years earlier, reportedly on a confidential mission to gauge the mood of the American colonies toward Britain. So he came to the war knowing more about America than almost any other European officer who served the cause. When the Revolution came, he sailed for America in 1777 in the same celebrated party as the young Marquis de Lafayette, and threw in his lot with a rebellion an ocean away from anything he had ever known. Ask why a 59-year-old man with nothing personal to gain would do that, would cross the sea to fight for a country not his own, and then walk 30 miles a day on his own feet to share the suffering of its soldiers. And you arrive at the thing that makes him the moral center of this story. He seems genuinely to have believed in the cause. His dying words, which we will come to, were not about glory or grievance. They were about the rights of man and the valor of the troops he led. Set that beside Horatio Gates and his fast horse, and the whole tragedy of Camden is contained in the comparison. The foreign volunteer who stayed and bled, and the native hero who ran. Under him served capable veterans. Brigadier General William Smallwood led the 1st Maryland Brigade. Brigadier General Mordecai Gist led the 2nd Maryland Brigade and the Delaware Regiment. And among the officer corps was a man whose name you should hold on to, because without him this story would barely survive at all. Colonel Otho Holland Williams of the 6th Maryland, educated, elegant, sharp-eyed, and, as it turned out, the chronicler whose detailed written account of the campaign is the closest thing we have to a witness in the room. Almost everything specific we know about the suffering of this army, we know because Williams lived and wrote it down. He is our primary source. Keep him in mind. When this video says the men were breaking ranks all night, that is Williams's phrase, not invention. The march south was an ordeal from the start. The army was badly supplied the moment it left New Jersey, living hand-to-mouth off local foraging, and a supply chain that barely existed. By late June 1780, when the Continentals reached Hillsborough, North Carolina, they got the news that changed everything. Charleston had fallen a month before. The objective they had been racing toward no longer existed. DeKalb now found himself deep in unfamiliar, often hostile country, cut off from his purpose and short of the militia reinforcements he had been promised. Worse, the land itself was starving. Central North Carolina in the summer of 1780 was reeling from 2 straight years of poor harvests on top of the chaos the war had inflicted on the economy. There simply was not enough food. DeKalb had no choice but to halt, to slow his men to a crawl, to camp at a place called Cox's Mill and scavenge for survival while he waited for orders. His soldiers endured brutal heat, sudden violent thunderstorms, and a grinding, chronic hunger that never let up. This is the condition of the army, already hungry, already worn. At the moment command of it was about to change hands, and that change is where the tragedy truly begins. While DeKalb fought just to keep his hungry men together, politics intervened from a distance, the way it so often does in this war. The Continental Congress was desperate for a victory and deeply suspicious of the generals Washington favored. So, on the 13th of June, 1780, acting on its own authority, Congress reached past Washington and handed command of the entire Southern Department to Major General Horatio Gates. To understand what happened next, you have to understand Gates, and you have to resist the easy cartoon, because the truth is more useful than the caricature. Gates was genuinely famous. In 1777, he had been the commanding general at Saratoga, the campaign that forced the surrender of an entire British army under Burgoyne. The victory that brought France into the war on the American side, and arguably saved the Revolution. For that, Gates was celebrated across the colonies as the hero of Saratoga. It was a real and enormous reputation. But within the officer corps, the view of him was far more complicated. Gates was an able administrator, organized, methodical with paperwork, a competent adjutant. As an independent commander in the field, though, his record was thin, and the suspicion among many of his peers was that his great triumph had really belonged to his subordinates. At Saratoga, he had leaned heavily on officers like Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan, men who did the hard tactical work. Gates was also, by many accounts, ambitious in a way that bred enemies, a political operator openly cool toward Washington, the suspected center of more than one intrigue against the commander-in-chief. Whether that's wholly fair to him, we can debate. What's not in doubt is that the man Congress sent to save the South had never truly proven he could win a battle on his own. He arrived at the camp at Cox's Mill on the 25th of July, 1780, and formally took command, relieving DeKalb of the department, while leaving the Baron in direct command of the Continental Division. And here we get the first glimpse of the gap between Gates's confidence and his army's reality. He looked over a force that was starving, exhausted, and badly outnumbered by the British scattered across the region. Roughly 1,200 Maryland and Delaware Continentals, a small artillery detachment, and Colonel Charles Armand's Legion, a unit of about 120 foreign volunteers and Hessian deserters. And Gates, surveying these hungry men, gave them a name. He called them the Grand Army. Hold on to that phrase. The Grand Army. He meant it without irony. Within 3 weeks, it would be a phrase that history could only repeat with a grimace. Gates did not wait. Intelligence reached him that the British garrison at Camden was held by only about 700 men under Lord Rawdon, a tempting, vulnerable prize, and the supply depot of the whole region besides. Gates saw a fast, glorious victory waiting for him, and he resolved to march on Camden at once. Before he did, he gathered his senior officers, and what happened in that meeting is the hinge of the entire campaign, the moment where it could still have gone another way. DeKalb and Colonel Williams argued hard against marching straight at Camden. They proposed instead a longer western route, looping the army through Salisbury and Charlotte. On a map, it looked slower. In reality, it was the only sane choice, for reasons that were not subtle. The western route ran through fertile, friendly country, territory thick with Patriot sympathizers who could feed the army, supply it, tend its sick, and where the local militia gathering in the west could safely join up. It was the road that kept the army alive. The direct route to Camden was the opposite of all that, and Williams told Gates so in writing, in words that have survived. He warned that the country the direct road crossed was, in his phrase, naturally barren, abounding with sandy plains, intersected by swamps, and very thinly inhabited, and what few people did live there were largely hostile, fiercely loyalist. There was nothing to eat. There was no friendly population. There was only sand, swamp, heat, and enemies. Gates listened to his veteran officers, the giant who walked beside his men, the colonel who knew the ground, and he rejected them. He ordered the direct march, south immediately into the Pine Barrens. On the 27th of July, 1780, the Grand Army stepped off the good road and onto the bad one, and from that moment the killing arithmetic began. It is worth pausing on what this decision actually was, because it's the kind of mistake that recurs across military history. Gates was not lacking information. He had been told clearly and specifically, by the men best positioned to know, exactly what the direct route would cost. He had a better option laid out in front of him in plain language. He chose against it, out of haste, out of a hunger for a quick victory, and out of a refusal to believe that subordinates might understand the situation better than the hero of Saratoga. The enemy had not yet done anything. The army was being marched to its destruction by its own commander, and the soldiers carrying their muskets into the sand had no idea. Everything Williams had warned about came true within days. The Sandhills region of the Carolinas turned out to be exactly the wasteland he had described. Whatever thin agriculture the land had once supported had already been picked clean by earlier foraging. The supply wagons trailed far behind on the bad roads. There was no commissary network worth the name to draw from, and the result was immediate and predictable. The Grand Army began to starve on the march. Williams's account of these days in late July and early August is one of the most harrowing documents in the literature of the Revolution, precisely because it is so specific and so unglamorous. The men, he records, were driven by hunger to eat whatever the land offered, ripe or not. They pulled green ears of corn from the fields and boiled them, desperately trying to make the unripe kernels soft enough to swallow, sometimes mixing them with whatever miserable lean beef could be found. When there was no corn, they ate green, unripe peaches in place of bread. Think about what that does to a human body. Raw, unripe fiber and badly cooked meat, eaten by men already weakened by weeks of hunger and heat. The consequence was not just discomfort. It was illness, gut-wrenching, strength-sapping sickness, spreading through the ranks before a single redcoat had come into view. The desperation reached almost surreal extremes. 18th century soldiers carried hair powder, a fine starch used to dress their hair in the military fashion of the day. And the men, having nothing else to thicken the thin water they were calling soup, began stirring their cosmetic hair powder into it, trying to wring a few more calories out of ground starch meant for grooming. Sergeant Major William Seymour of the Delaware Regiment kept a journal through all of this, and his entry cuts to the bone. The men, he wrote, were living on a half-pound of rancid beef and on green apples and peaches, which rendered our situation truly miserable, and surrounded on all sides by our enemies. Surrounded on all sides by our enemies, and not yet in any of this had the enemy fired a shot. The army's first and most relentless adversary was the road its own general had chosen, and yet, even as the men sickened, the army grew larger, which would prove to be a curse dressed as a blessing. As Gates pushed south, militia contingents converged on him. By the time he reached Rugeley's Mill, also called Claremont, about 12 miles north of Camden, On the 13th of August, his numbers had swelled dramatically. Major General Richard Caswell brought in roughly 1,800 North Carolina militiamen. Brigadier General Edward Stevens arrived with about 700 Virginia militiamen. Colonel Charles Porterfield came up with a sharp little detachment of about 100 Virginia State Light Infantry, good troops, whom Gates put out front as scouts. On paper, this pushed Gates's strength past 4,000 men, somewhere between 900 and 1,200, Continental regulars, and nearly 3,000 militia. It looked like an army of conquest. But the paper and the reality had almost nothing to do with each other. And here Gates revealed a second, quieter failure that compounded the first. He genuinely did not know how many men he had. Gates was operating under the cheerful belief that he commanded a host of 7,000 effectives, a fantasy. It was Colonel Williams, doing the unglamorous work of an adjutant, who finally put the real morning returns in front of him. The Army had only 3,052 men actually fit for duty. The commander of the Southern Department was off by more than half in his estimate of his own strength on the eve of battle. A general who does not know the size of his own army does not know in any real sense what he can ask it to do. And the great majority of those present were untrained militia. Farmers and townsmen who had never stood in a firing line, who had never felt the ground shake under a bayonet charge, and who were, like the regulars, already weak with hunger and sickness. This was the Grand Army as it actually existed on the night of the 15th of August. Smaller than its general believed, sicker than any army should be, and about to be made sicker still by one final, almost unbelievable blunder. On the 15th of August, the eve of the battle, Gates decided to push his army closer to Camden under cover of darkness and take up a defensive position behind a watercourse called Saunders Creek. He ordered a forced night march to begin at 10 o'clock. Now, there was a custom in 18th century armies before a night march or an imminent fight. You issued the men a ration of rum. It steadied the nerves, lifted morale, and gave a quick jolt of calories to exhausted soldiers. It was standard, expected, understood, but the Grand Army's commissary had no rum. What it had recently acquired was a supply of molasses, and so the order went out to issue molasses to the men instead. Williams recorded the reasoning with a dry, devastating economy. It was, he wrote, unluckily conceived that molasses would for once be an acceptable substitute. It was not. Consider the state of these men's digestive systems. For weeks they had been eating green corn, unripe peaches, rancid beef, and starch. Their guts were already in revolt. Now on top of all that came a heavy ration of molasses, and the combination was chemically catastrophic. A violent epidemic of dysentery swept the camp almost at once. Williams's description is unsparing and clinical, and it is the single most important sentence for understanding what happened the next morning. The molasses, he wrote, operated so cathartically as to disorder very many of the men who were breaking the ranks all night and were certainly much debilitated before the action commenced in the morning. Read that again. Breaking the ranks all night. Much debilitated before the action commenced. This is the army that was about to fight Lord Cornwallis. The 1,200 Continentals and the thousands of militia who formed up in the dark on the night of August 15th were not merely inexperienced. They were sick, dehydrated, sleep-starved, many of them stumbling out of the column again and again through the night, ravaged by an illness their own commander's logistics had inflicted on them. They were beaten men marching toward a battle that had not yet begun. Not the British, not the terrain, the food, the road, the man who chose them both. While Gates marched his ruined army toward Camden, the situation at the British end had quietly transformed into something far more dangerous than the 700 men Gates thought he was hunting. Lord Rawdon, the young commander at Camden, was not asleep. The moment he got word that an American army was advancing, he pulled in his scattered outer posts and sent an urgent summons to Cornwallis. And Cornwallis, who grasped immediately that the loss of Camden would unravel his entire hold on South Carolina, moved fast. He left Charleston on the 9th of August and reached Camden on the 13th, taking personal command of the field army. It is worth stopping here to look hard at the man Gates was actually about to fight, because the contrast between the two commanders is the engine of everything that follows. Charles, Lord Cornwallis, was in many ways the precise opposite of Horatio Gates. Where Gates was an administrator who had borrowed his great victory from his subordinates, Cornwallis was a fighting general in the fullest sense, aggressive, decisive, willing to gamble, and personally brave to the point of recklessness. He had a habit, unusual for a general of his rank, of staying close behind his own front line where he could see the battle developing with his own eyes and react in real time. That habit would matter enormously at Camden, because it was Cornwallis personally, watching from just behind his ranks, who spotted the wobble in the American militia and ordered the blow that broke them in the moment it could do the most damage. He was also, at this point, a commander under real pressure, and good commanders are often most dangerous when cornered. Cornwallis could not simply sit in Camden and wait. He did not have the supplies to endure a siege, and he understood that if Gates's army established itself and the partisans tightened around him, his whole position in South Carolina could come apart from the inside. He weighed sitting still and slowly losing against marching out and risk everything on a single roll, and characteristically, he chose to attack. He would rather seize the initiative and force the issue on his own terms than surrender it, and let the enemy choose the time and place. It was exactly the calculation Gates should have feared, and exactly the calculation Gates seems never to have imagined his enemy might make. Gates was hunting a sleepy garrison of 700. He was, in reality, marching straight at one of the best field generals the British Empire had, a man who had already decided to come find him. Two armies were now closing on each other in the dark, and the one with the worst position on paper was led by the far better soldier. What Gates was actually marching toward was a force of roughly 2,100 to 2,240 men, under one of the most aggressive and competent generals in the British service. And it's worth being honest that the British were suffering too. The Carolina summer was no kinder to redcoats than to Continentals, and nearly 1,000 men in Camden were laid up sick in the hospital. But Cornwallis's fighting corps was formidable, around 1,500 regular infantry and provincial troops, supported by 600 loyalist militia. Among them were regiments rated among the finest line infantry in the world. These were not garrison troops. These were professional killers at the peak of their discipline. Cornwallis did his own arithmetic and reached a hard conclusion. He did not have the supplies to sit inside Camden and endure a siege. His best defense, he decided, was to attack first, to strike the Americans before they could close in. So he ordered his army to march north, out of Camden, to fall on Gates at Rugeley's Mill. And now we arrive at one of the strangest coincidences in all of military history. On the very same night, the 15th of August, at the very same hour, 10 o'clock in the evening, both generals ordered their armies to march, along the very same road, the Great Wagon Road, directly toward each other. Gates was marching south to dig in behind Saunders Creek. Cornwallis was marching north to surprise the Americans at dawn. Neither man had any idea the other was on the move. Two armies in the dark, on one road, closing the distance between them with every step, each believing it would find the enemy asleep. It is the kind of coincidence that would seem contrived if a novelist invented it. Two opposing commanders, neither in contact with the other, neither possessing accurate intelligence, independently arriving at the same plan, a night march to surprise the foe at dawn, and choosing not just the same night but the same hour and the same stretch of road to do it on. Across the whole sweep of military history, there are few moments quite so purely accidental in their setup and so total in their consequence. Had either general chosen a different hour or moved a few miles east or west, the Battle of Camden as it happened would never have occurred at all. Instead, two columns of exhausted men felt their way south and north through the same darkness, the dust rising under thousands of feet, the only certainty being that somewhere ahead lay an enemy who did not expect them. Picture it from inside the American column. The men had been roused at 10 at night, sick, hollow, with hunger, many of them already slipping out of the ranks again and again with the dysentery. The molasses had loosed in them. They marched under a full moon that lit the pale sandy road, a low ridge walled by black swamp on either side. They believed they were marching to fall on a sleeping garrison. They had no idea that the entire British Southern Army, with Tarleton's dreaded Legion at its head, was at that very moment marching up the same road to do exactly the same thing to them. And then, at around 2:30 in the morning, some 5 miles north of Camden, the front of the one column simply walked into the front of the other, and the night exploded. The collision was sudden, violent, and terrifying. At the front of the American column rode Colonel Armand's cavalry and the light infantry under Colonel Porterfield. Coming the other way was the vanguard of the British Army, and at its head, of all the officers in the King's service, was the one whose name struck the most fear into patriot hearts, Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton and his British Legion. Out of the darkness came muskets at point-blank range, the flash and roar of close-quarters fire, men and horses screaming, no one able to see clearly what they were fighting. Armand's cavalry, outmatched by Tarleton's veteran dragoons, broke and fell back in confusion, and their panic rippled instantly back through the leading American ranks. But the worst blow of those few minutes was the loss of a single man. Colonel Charles Porterfield, one of the most capable light infantry commanders the American Army had, exactly the kind of officer the Green Virginia militia would need beside them when the sun came up, was hit and mortally wounded in the opening volleys. The Patriot left wing had just lost the steady hand it could least afford to lose, and the battle proper had not even begun. Both sides reeled back from the shock. They took a few prisoners off each other, and from those prisoners the appalling truth became clear to both commanders at roughly the same moment. This was not a skirmish with an outpost or a scouting party. Each had just run headlong into the entire main body of the other's army. Stunned, both sides broke contact, pulled back a short distance, and settled down to wait under arms in the dark for the dawn that would decide everything. It is hard to overstate what that midnight collision did to the American army psychologically, and especially to the militia. These men had been told, in effect, that they were going to march down and pounce on a weak, isolated garrison of 700. Now, in the black hours before dawn, sick with dysentery, exhausted past the point of clear thought, they understood that they were instead standing face to face with the whole British Southern Army and its most feared cavalry commander. The fear in the ranks must have been a physical thing. Gates, rattled, called a hasty council of war right there on the field and asked his officers what to do. By the account Williams left us, the commanding general seemed genuinely lost, unsure how to proceed. And it was Brigadier General Edward Stevens of the Virginia militia who finally said the thing no one wanted to say. It was too late. You could not, in the dark with untrained and frightened militia, organize an orderly retreat in the face of British cavalry. Try it, and the withdrawal would simply turn into a rout the moment Tarleton's horsemen got among them. So the option of escape closed before the sun rose. Gates was now committed to fight a pitched, stand-up battle against Lord Cornwallis. On ground he had not chosen, with an army that was sick, outmatched in regulars, and already half broken before the first cannon spoke. The decisions that doomed the Grand Army had all been made. All that remained was for the morning to reveal their cost. When the sun came up on the 16th of August, 1780, the two armies found themselves in an open forest of longleaf pines, and the ground itself had set a trap that neither general could escape. The great wagon road ran straight down the middle of the field. On both sides, east and west, the dry ground gave way quickly to deep, impassable marshland feeding into Gum Swamp and Saunders Creek. The effect was to turn the battlefield into a funnel. There was no room to sweep around a flank, no space for the wide cavalry maneuvers that decided so many battles of the age. Whatever happened here would happen head-on, line against line, in the narrow corridor between the swamps. In that corridor, Gates had perhaps 3,000 effective men against Cornwallis's roughly 2,000. Outnumbered overall, the British held the one advantage that would matter most, the quality and proportion of their regulars. And then both generals proceeded to deploy according to a tradition so deeply embedded in 18th century warfare that following it felt less like a choice than like obeying a law of nature. That tradition is what destroyed the American army. The doctrine was simple. The right wing of a battle line was the post of honor. You placed your best, most experienced troops on the right and your least reliable troops on the left. Every European trained officer of the era knew this in his bones. Gates followed it to the letter. He put his elite Continentals, the 2nd Maryland Brigade and the Delaware Regiment, under General Gist with DeKalb overseeing, on the American right, west of the road, in the post of honor. In the center he placed Caswell's North Carolina militia and the artillery, and on the American left, east of the road, he stationed his weakest, greenest, sickest troops, the completely unseasoned Virginia militia under General Stevens, with the remnants of Armand's cavalry and Porterfield's now leaderless infantry behind them. He kept Smallwood's 1st Maryland Brigade in reserve, about 200 yards back. It was, by the book, a perfectly orthodox deployment. And here is the lethal irony at the heart of Camden. Cornwallis followed the exact same book. Cornwallis put his finest, most seasoned regulars on his right wing, the veteran 23rd Regiment of Foot, the Royal Welch Fusiliers, and the 33rd Regiment under his best line officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Webster. The 23rd and the 33rd were among the deadliest infantry in the world. Now lay the two lines on top of each other and see what the doctrine had built. On the western side of the road, the elite American Continentals faced Rawdon's provincial troops, a fair, brutal, evenly matched fight. But on the eastern side of the road, the post of honor on the British right stood directly opposite the post of weakness on the American left. The finest line infantry in the British Army, the 23rd and the 33rd, were aimed squarely at the exhausted, sick, terrified Virginia militiamen who had never fought a battle in their lives. Two generals, obeying the same respected doctrine, had between them arranged one of the most one-sided tactical mismatches in military history, and neither of them had to. The orthodoxy that was supposed to bring order to the battlefield instead guaranteed that the weakest men present would be hit by the strongest blow. Gates would have known, had he stopped to look across the field, that his left was about to be murdered. There is no sign that he looked. It's worth understanding why this doctrine existed at all, because the point is not that the rule was stupid. It is that a sensible rule can become lethal when it is applied without thought. The post of honor on the right had roots that went back to antiquity, to the way ancient phalanxes tended to drift rightward as each man edged behind the shield of the soldier beside him, so that the right flank became the decisive, dangerous, prestigious end of the line. By the 18th century, it had hardened into convention. The senior, the elite, the most trusted troops took the right. The green and the unreliable were tucked away on the left, where, in theory, they would be steadied by the army's center and bear the least weight. As a default, in a vacuum, it was reasonable enough. But a battlefield is not a vacuum, and the convention contained a hidden flaw that Camden exposed perfectly. If both armies follow it, then your best troops end up facing the enemy's worst, and your worst end up facing the enemy's best. Your right against their left, your left against their right. In a balanced army, the mismatch on one wing roughly cancels the mismatch on the other. But Gates's army was not balanced. His best were genuine elite regulars. His worst were sick, untrained militia who had never been in a fight. So when the convention placed those militia on his left, directly opposite the cream of the British line, the cancellation did not happen. The weak wing was catastrophically weak, and it was aimed at the strongest thing on the field. A commander who was thinking, really looking at the specific men in front of him rather than reaching for the textbook, might have broken the convention. He might have stiffened the militia with regulars, or anchored them on a flank the enemy could not easily reach, or simply refused to stake the battle on whether farmers could outshoot the Royal Welch Fusiliers. Gates did none of that. He filed his men into the orthodox arrangement and let the doctrine make his decision for him. The rule was old and respected, and that was precisely the problem. He obeyed it instead of thinking, and the thinking was the part that would have saved him. The battle opened in the gray half-light. It was Colonel Williams, our chronicler, again in the thick of it, who, seeing the British still shaking out their formation on the right, urged that the American artillery open fire to feel out the range and perhaps catch the enemy mid-deployment. The guns under Captain Singleton spoke, and the British artillery answered at once, tearing what one account called horrid showers of grape through the American lines. And then the pines did something that turned the field into a nightmare. The morning was dense and humid, and the thick black powder smoke from the guns did not rise and clear. It hung low among the trees, rolling across the ground in a blinding fog. Within minutes, men could not see 50 yards. Command and control, already fragile, began to dissolve into smoke. Officers could not see their own lines, let alone the enemy's. This detail matters enormously for what came next, because it explains how one half of the American army could be destroyed while the other half fought on, unaware. Consider what the opening of the battle was actually like to stand inside. The artillery began the work, the American guns under Captain Singleton firing first to find the range, the British guns unlimbering and answering in moments, the two batteries hammering at each other across the narrow corridor of pines. Solid shot and grape tore through the lines and through the trees, splintering trunks, throwing up dirt, scything down men who never saw what hit them. And with every discharge, the smoke thickened until the white-gray pall lay over the whole field like a fog rolling in off a sea. There was no wind to carry it off in those first crucial minutes. The smoke simply accumulated, swallowing the morning light until the soldiers in the ranks existed inside a small, roaring, blinded world bounded by a few yards of visibility in any direction. For green militia who had never experienced anything remotely like this, The effect must have been close to unbearable before the infantry even moved. They could hear the guns, feel the concussion in their chests, see men around them fall to an enemy they could not even make out through the murk. And they had been awake all night, sick, weak, terrified, told they were chasing a small garrison, and now suddenly enveloped in the full violence of a pitched battle against the British main army. The fog of war at Camden was not a metaphor. It was a literal blinding cloud, and it set the stage for both halves of what followed: the panic that would consume the left, and the doomed, ignorant heroism of the right, whose Continentals could not see that the rest of the army had already ceased to exist. Cornwallis, posted close behind his lines and watching with a cold, expert eye, saw it instantly: the hesitation, the visible disorder among the Virginia militia on the American left. He knew opportunity when it stood in front of him. He ordered Webster to send the 23rd and the 33rd forward. The veteran regiments came on through the smoke in perfect order. At close range they halted, leveled their muskets, and delivered one devastating, synchronized volley into the militia. Then they gave a great cheer, dropped their bayonets level, and charged. For sick, frightened, untrained men, the sight and sound of disciplined British regulars emerging from the smoke with a roar and a hedge of steel was simply unendurable. The Virginia militia did not break under the bayonets. They broke before the bayonets ever reached them. They threw down their muskets and ran. The collapse was so total and so instant that, by the records, only 3 Virginians were so much as wounded in that opening assault. They did not stay long enough to be hit. It is tempting to call this cowardice and move on, but that is too easy, and it misses the real lesson. A rout is a physical and psychological event with its own brutal logic. Untrained men packed into a line, sick and exhausted and afraid, do not make individual reasoned decisions to flee. The fear moves through a crowd faster than any order can. One man turns, then the men beside him, then the whole mass dissolves at once. Each one running because everyone around him is running, and to stand alone is to die alone. The Virginia militia had been given no chance to become the kind of soldiers who can stand against that tide. They had been marched into sickness, kept awake all night, posted in the place of maximum danger, and confronted at close range by the most disciplined killers on the continent advancing, out of the smoke with leveled bayonets and a roar. Almost any body of untrained men, in that exact condition and that exact position, would have broken. Gates had arranged the conditions for a rout and then acted surprised when he got one. What made it catastrophic rather than merely costly was contagion. The fleeing Virginians did not run into open ground. They ran straight back, through Caswell's North Carolina militia in the center, and the panic leapt from one body of men to the next like fire through dry grass. In the space of a few minutes, the entire left and center of the American army simply evaporated, over 2,500 men throwing down their weapons and running, not in some prolonged collapse, but almost all at once, before the battle had truly begun. And every one of those men who ran left the Continentals on the right a little more exposed, a little more alone, until the elite of the army stood fighting brilliantly in a corner of a field that no longer had an army around it. Now we come to the part of this story that redeems it. The reason the Maryland and Delaware lines are remembered with honor and Horatio Gates is remembered with contempt. On the American right, west of the road, the Continentals had no idea any of this was happening. The same smoke that blinded everyone else hid the catastrophe on their left. So DeKalb, seeing the enemy in front of him and knowing nothing of the route behind him, did the opposite of run. He ordered his men to advance. The 2nd Maryland Brigade and the Delaware Regiment went forward into Rawdon's provincial troops and fought one of the fiercest stand-up actions of the entire war. The Delaware men charged the Legion infantry. The Marylanders drove into the Loyalist volunteers, and astonishingly, against the odds, against everything, they pushed the British line back. They gained ground. The fight degenerated into close, savage, hand-to-hand combat, musket butts and bayonets and fists in the smoke, and the old line was winning its corner of the battle. But a battle is not won in one corner. The destruction of the militia had torn a vast, unstoppable hole in the center of the American position, and Cornwallis moved to drive through it with the speed of a man who has seen the whole board. He wheeled Webster's victorious 23rd and 33rd, fresh from scattering the militia, to their left, and sent them crashing into the exposed flank of the Continentals. Gates's reserve, Smallwood's 1st Maryland Brigade, tried to come up and plug the gap, but they were swamped by the surging British infantry and broke apart before they could form a solid line. And so the Marylanders and Delawareans, who moments before had been advancing and winning, found themselves suddenly surrounded. Webster's regulars smashing into their flank, Rawdon's provincials in their front, and the impassable swamp pinning their other side so they could not even retreat. They were caged, and they kept fighting. At the center of that doomed pocket was the giant. DeKalb's horse was shot out from under him, so he fought on foot in the middle of his men, refusing every chance to surrender. He was struck again and again by musket balls and bayonet thrusts, and he stayed on his feet. 11 separate wounds. 11. Only when the 59-year-old Baron finally went down, bleeding from 11 wounds, did the Continental resistance at last begin to crumble. The men had held as long as the man who walked beside them on the march could stand. Sensing the end, Cornwallis loosed Tarleton's cavalry. The British Legion dragoons swept around the broken flanks and rode straight through the shattered Continental ranks, sabering the artillerymen at their guns, cutting down men trying to flee, finishing the destruction. A few small knots got away. A detachment of 50 or 60 men under Major Archibald Anderson kept their order and slipped back through the swamp, where the horsemen could not follow, carrying a fragment of discipline off a field that had lost everything else. But it was over. The Grand Army, the army Gates had named with such confidence 3 weeks before, had ceased to exist. And where in all of this was the commanding general? While DeKalb bled on the ground in the center of his last stand, while the Maryland and Delaware lines were being cut to pieces, Horatio Gates was not rallying his troops. He was not forming a rear guard. He was not directing the reserve or trying to save anything from the wreck. Horatio Gates was on horseback, riding north, as fast as the fastest animal in the army could carry him. When the militia broke at the very start of the action, Gates was caught up in the flood of fleeing men, and he kept going. He was mounted on a horse famous for its speed, and he put it to a gallop and did not look back. He outran the British cavalry, he outran the Loyalist partisans, he outran his own routing soldiers. By nightfall on the day of the battle, he had covered an astonishing 60 miles and reached Charlotte, North Carolina, and he did not stop there. Over the next days, he kept fleeing, all the way to Hillsborough, somewhere between 180 and 200 miles from the battlefield, arriving by the accounts in about 3.5 days. It destroyed him. Not the battle, the flight. A general may lose a battle and keep his honor. Armies are lost and reputations survive. But a general who abandons his army at the height of its agony and rides 200 miles to safety has done something the service does not forgive. Alexander Hamilton put the knife in with a single famous line of contempt, asking whether there had ever been an instance of a general running from his whole army as Gates had. 180 miles in 3 days. And a half, Hamilton wrote acidly. It does admirable credit to the activity of a man at his time of life. Otho Williams, reporting afterward, recorded plainly that Gates had used the utmost expedition in getting from the lost field. The hero of Saratoga rode into the history books that day as the coward of Camden. His independent command was, for all practical purposes, finished. The phrase he had coined, the Grand Army, survived him only as an epitaph. The morning after revealed what the smoke had hidden. The great wagon road running north, the road of the army's flight, was a scene out of a nightmare. One British officer's description survives, and it needs no embellishment. The road, he wrote, was for miles strewn with the wounded and killed who had been overtaken by the Legion in their pursuit, littered with dead horses, broken wagons, and baggage, a perfect scene of horror and confusion. Tarleton's cavalry had chased the broken Americans for more than 20 miles, cutting down stragglers and making absolutely certain that no remnant could pause, turn, and reform. There would be no rally. The destruction was meant to be total, and it was. Now we have to do the accounting. And here, as our sources themselves insist, we have to be honest about what is documented and what is estimated. The British losses are recorded with confidence, and they are small. 68 killed, 245 wounded, 11 missing, 324 men total. That is the price Cornwallis paid to destroy an entire American army. The American losses are larger, and they are murkier, and any honest reconstruction has to say so. The best estimates put American killed and wounded at somewhere between 800 and 900, with roughly another 1,000 taken prisoner, call it 1,900 casualties or more, on top of the thousands who simply scattered. We should be candid that these are estimates. The precise figures are not as cleanly recorded as the British ones, and you will see slightly different numbers in different accounts. But the shape of the thing is not in doubt. One army went home largely intact. The other was annihilated. The individual regiments tell the story in miniature. The Delaware Regiment had gone into the fight with about 275 men. It came out with roughly 70 killed, 70 wounded, and 60 captured, more than half its strength gone, and as a regimental entity it effectively ceased to exist. Its survivors folded into two small companies of fewer than 100 men. Williams, the adjutant, tallied something on the order of 832 casualties among the Marylanders alone, of whom around 500 were taken prisoner. Cornwallis, worried about disease spreading in the crowded town, broke these prisoners into detachments of 150 and marched them under guard to brutal captivity in Charleston, a march many of them did not survive. It is easy, with numbers this large, to let them go abstract. 800 here, 1,000 there, regiments ceasing to exist. So it's worth slowing down and remembering what those figures actually were. Each one was a man who had marched south on his own feet through the heat, who had eaten green corn and unripe peaches because there was nothing else, who had stirred hair powder into water and called it food, who had been kept awake all the night before the battle by an illness inflicted on him by his own commander, and who had then been ordered to stand and fight the finest infantry in the world. Some of them ran, and who, in that condition, can entirely blame them? Many of them did not, and they paid for it. The ones taken prisoner faced a particular horror. We already saw what British captivity in the southern summer had done to the men captured at Charleston a few months earlier. The prison ships, the disease, the fraction who lived to be exchanged. The Camden prisoners were marched back toward that same fate, and a great many of them simply died on the road or in confinement, far from home, their names mostly unrecorded. The Delaware Regiment, which had been rated among the best light infantry on earth, was reduced to fewer than 100 men crammed into two understrength companies, and entire proud unit effectively wiped from the Army's rolls in a single morning and the captivity that followed. This is the part the casualty tables cannot hold. Behind the clean British figure of 324 and the murky American figure of 1900 plus are thousands of individual ruined lives and the families who would learn of them by rumor and letter over the months to come. War remembers the generals and the regiments and the strategic consequences. It tends to forget that every number in the ledger was a person who had a name and ate green peaches in the pines, and trusted that the man giving the orders knew what he was doing. And that brings us back to the number this whole story hangs on. When the scattered survivors of the Southern Army finally trickled together at the rallying point in Hillsborough, North Carolina, over the weeks that followed, and someone counted the effective troops who answered, the men still fit to carry a musket, the total came to about 700. Out of a vanguard of 1,200 elite regulars, out of a combined army of more than 4,000, 1,200 marched into South Carolina. 700 came back. That is not a turn of phrase. That is the arithmetic of the campaign, and almost none of it was written by British muskets. It was written on a barren road, and in a ration of molasses, and in a famous general's refusal to listen. There is one more contrast to draw, and it is the cruelest one in the story, between the general who survived and the general who did not. Baron de Kalb, with his 11 wounds, was taken prisoner on the field, and the British, to their lasting credit, treated him with extraordinary honor. Cornwallis sent his own personal physicians to tend the dying man. When it emerged that de Kalb was a fellow Freemason, Cornwallis saw to it that he was treated with every possible dignity. But 11 wounds are 11 wounds, and no 18th century medicine could close them. De Kalb lingered 3 days and died on the 19th of August, 1780. In his last hours, he dictated a final letter to Otho Williams, fittingly the man who would carry the memory of all of this forward, and in it he did not speak of himself. He spoke of his soldiers. He praised the valor of his Maryland and Delaware men, the ones who had stood and fought and died around him, and he said that he died the death of a soldier, fighting for the rights of man. Cornwallis ordered him buried at Camden with full military and Masonic honors, an enemy general burying a foe with reverence because the soldier had earned it. Decades later, in 1825, the aging Marquis de Lafayette would come to Camden in person to lay the cornerstone of a monument to his old comrade. The man who walked beside his troops was not forgotten by the people who understood what he had done. The man on the fast horse was not allowed to forget what he had not done. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that it was the enemy who honored him. Cornwallis had every practical reason to feel nothing for a dying foreign mercenary on the losing side. Instead, he sent his own surgeons, ensured the old man's dignity, and buried him with full military and Masonic ceremony, the rites of respect that one professional soldier renders to another whose courage he recognizes as the equal of his own. The British understood exactly what DeKalb had done on that field, because they were the ones he had done it to. They had felt the Maryland and Delaware lines push their provincials back. They had seen the giant on foot in the smoke, refusing to go down, soaking up wound after wound while his men held around him. You do not bury an ordinary prisoner with honors. You bury a man whose stand has earned the respect even of the people who killed him, and that is the verdict history has largely kept. DeKalb's name is scattered across the American map. Towns, counties, streets in states he died defending and never lived to see at peace, fixed there by a young republic's gratitude for a man who crossed an ocean and gave everything for a cause that was not by birth his own. The contrast with his commanding general could not be sharper or crueler. On the same morning, on the same field, two American generals made their choices. One stayed and bled and was buried with the honors of his enemies. The other rode away and outran his own army into a disgrace that 2 centuries have not lifted. Camden took the better man and spared the worse, the way battles so often do, and then left it to the rest of us to remember which was which. As if the destruction of the Continental Army were not enough, the catastrophe widened in the days right after the battle. And it is worth following because it shows how completely the bottom fell out of the Patriot cause in those few days. 2 days after Camden, on the 18th of August, Banastra Tarleton, the same cavalry commander who had just helped break the Grand Army, turned on the partisans. He found Thomas Sumter's command resting along Fishing Creek, careless, their guard down, some of the men unarmed, some bathing in the river. Tarleton struck like lightning. He killed or wounded over 150 of Sumter's men, captured around 300 more, and recovered the British supply wagons Sumter had earlier taken. Sumter himself barely escaped, fleeing bareback on an unsaddled horse, his command shattered behind him. Stop and measure that span of time. In less than 96 hours, the British had destroyed both pillars of the resistance in South Carolina at once, the conventional Continental Army at Camden, and the largest organized partisan force in the state at Fishing Creek. To anyone surveying the South in the 3rd week of August 1780, it must have looked as though the rebellion in the Carolinas was simply over. Cornwallis had won everything. The map was his. And yet, and this is the strange grace buried in the disaster, the worst defeat of the Southern War was about to produce the conditions for the victory that would end it. Here is the paradox that makes Camden worth understanding, rather than merely mourning. The annihilation of the Southern Army did something no Patriot victory could have done. It finally pried the Southern Department out of the wrong hands. Gates's flight had destroyed his reputation so completely that Congress could no longer protect him. The body that had reached past Washington to appoint the hero of Saratoga now had no choice but to hand the Southern command to the man Washington had wanted all along, Major General Nathaniel Greene, a self-taught Quaker's son from Rhode Island, a former foundry man with a limp and a borrowed library's worth of military reading. Greene was, by temperament and study, almost the precise opposite of Horatio Gates. What Greene inherited that December was wreckage, the traumatized 700 survivors and very little else. He did not pretend otherwise. And from that wreckage he built the campaign that won the South by doing, point for point, the opposite of what Gates had done. Where Gates had ignored his logistics and starved his men into sickness, Greene made supply and the condition of his soldiers the foundation of everything, refusing to march an army he could not feed. Where Gates had thrown raw militia into a stand-up fight against the best regulars in the world, Greene learned to use militia for what they were good at, and to spare them what they were not, weaving the partisan bands of Marion and Sumter and Pickens into a single integrated strategy, rather than leaving them to fight and die alone. And where Gates had hungered for one big, glorious, decisive battle, Greene embraced the opposite logic, the logic of maneuver and attrition. He would later sum up his own campaign in a phrase that became famous. He fought, got beaten, rose, and fought again. He lost battles on points and won the war on the whole. Marching Cornwallis ragged across the Carolinas, bleeding the British Army in engagement after engagement until it had worn itself thin chasing him. That bleeding had names and dates. In January of 1781, Greene took the daring step of dividing his small army in the face of a stronger enemy and sent Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, one of the very officers whose tactical skill had really won Saratoga for Gates years before, into the South Carolina backcountry. At a cattle grazing ground called the Cow Pens on the 17th of January, Morgan turned and fought Banastra Tarleton and handed the Legion the most lopsided defeat of its career. He used his unreliable militia exactly as Gates had not, placing them out front with orders to fire only a volley or two and then fall back, so that their inevitable withdrawal became part of the plan rather than the ruin of it. Among the regulars who shattered Tarleton's line that day were Maryland and Delaware Continentals, the same lineage that had stood and died at Camden. The cavalry commander who had sealed the slaughter at Camden and cut down Sumter's men at Fishing Creek was, at Cowpens, driven from the field in headlong flight. 2 months later, in March of 1781, Greene met Cornwallis himself at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. Greene lost the field that day, in the narrow sense. He withdrew and left Cornwallis holding the ground. But he had made the British pay a price they could not afford, killing and wounding something close to a quarter of Cornwallis's army in a few hours of hard fighting. The reaction in London became famous. A leading member of Parliament remarked that another such victory would ruin the British army. It was the lesson of Camden run exactly in reverse, a battle lost on points that was, in the only accounting that finally mattered, a catastrophe for the side that won it. It was that slow bleeding, begun in the ashes of Camden, built on the backs of the 700, that drove Cornwallis north, out of the Carolinas into Virginia, and finally into the trap on the peninsula at a little tobacco port called Yorktown, where in October of 1781 the Southern War that had seemed lost forever in August of 1780 came to its end with a British surrender and the effective close of the Revolution. None of that was visible on the road north from Camden, choked with the dead, but it was the direct consequence of what happened there. The disaster forced the change in command, and the change in command produced the strategy, and the strategy won the war. Camden was the painful, necessary crucible, the catastrophe that finally taught the American war effort how the South actually had to be fought. Ask most people to name a battle of the American Revolution and they will say Lexington, or Saratoga, or Yorktown. The victories, the beginnings, and the endings. Camden rarely makes the list, and there are reasons for that, reasons worth naming, because they tell us something about how history decides what to keep. Part of it is simply that Camden was a defeat, and a humiliating one, with no heroic last-minute reversal to soften it. Triumphant nations tend to build their memory around their triumphs. A rout in which the commanding general fled 200 miles is not the stuff of monuments and holidays. Part of it is that the brilliance of Camden, such as it is technical and grim rather than dramatic and uplifting. Its lessons live in the unglamorous machinery of war, supply lines, the chemistry of a starving man's stomach, the deployment conventions of linear infantry. That is much harder to put on a canvas than a flag bearer charging a hill. The most personally dramatic figure in the whole battle, the dying giant de Kalb, is remembered. There are towns and counties named for him across the United States, and a monument at Camden. But the systemic causes of the disaster, the things that actually decided it, resist being turned into a good story. And part of it is that Camden is, in the end, a story about an American failure on the American side. It is easier to teach the day the militia won than the day the militia ran, but that is exactly why it's worth teaching. The battles we lose, examined honestly, tend to have more to say than the ones we win. As for the people who lived it, Otho Holland Williams, the colonel who saw it all and wrote it down, survived, served on, and left the account that lets us reconstruct the campaign at all. Without him, Camden would be a blur of second-hand numbers instead of the precise, terrible human record we have. Cornwallis won his great victory, and then, a little over a year later, signed away the war at Yorktown. Tarleton went on being feared and hated in roughly equal measure. Nathaniel Greene took the 700 survivors and built the campaign that redeemed the South. And Horatio Gates lived another 2 decades in the long shadow of a single morning's flight, never holding important field command again, the hero of Saratoga, permanently outrun by the coward of Camden. Strip away the muskets and the powder smoke, and Camden becomes a set of principles that have not aged a day in 2.5 centuries. Modern armies study disasters like this one, not because anyone still fights in Pine Barren firing lines, but because the mistakes that destroyed the Grand Army are the kind that human beings under pressure make in every era. The first lesson is the oldest one in war. Logistics decides battles before tactics ever get the chance. Camden was lost on the march, not in the pines. There is a saying in modern military circles that amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics, and Camden is its grim illustration. Napoleon would relearn it in the snows of Russia in 1812, where it was not the Russian army but the collapse of supply that destroyed the largest force Europe had ever assembled. Gates had a starving army and chose the road with no food. Everything after that was a formality. The second lesson is about command and counsel. Gates was not short on information, he was short on humility. His best officers told him, in writing in specific words, exactly what the direct route would cost. He overruled them out of haste and pride. A commander who surrounds himself with capable advisors and then refuses to hear them has converted his greatest asset into dead weight. The warning that goes unheeded is, in practice, no warning at all. The third lesson is that reputation is not the same thing as competence. Gates arrived trailing the glory of Saratoga, but Saratoga had been won in large part by the men beneath him, by Arnold, by Morgan, and that borrowed brilliance did not transfer to an independent command. History is full of leaders promoted on the strength of one success they did not fully author, handed a harder problem, and found wanting. The medal on the chest does not guarantee the judgment in the moment. The fourth lesson is that doctrine followed without thought becomes a weapon in the enemy's hands. The post of honor convention was sound enough as a general rule, but applied blindly by both generals on that funnel of a battlefield. It guaranteed that the weakest American troops would face the strongest British ones. The lesson is not that rules are useless. It is that a rule applied without looking at the actual ground is a trap. Armies relearn this every time they fall in love with a playbook. The French and their static Maginot Line in 1940 are only the most famous case of a doctrine that became a cage. The fifth lesson is that the condition of soldiers is itself a combat factor, as real as their number or their guns. The men at Camden were not cowards by nature. The same militia tradition produced men who fought hard on other fields. But sick, sleepless, dehydrated, and terrified men break, and no amount of paper strength changes that. An army's morale and physical state are not soft, secondary concerns. They are the thing that decides whether a line holds or runs. The sixth lesson is that a commander must know his real strength, not his imagined one. Gates believed he led 7,000 men. He led barely 3,000 fit for duty. That gap, that self-deception at the very top, shaped every reckless decision he made. Clear-eyed knowledge of your own capacity is the precondition for any sound plan. Optimism that floats free of the morning returns is just a slower way of losing. And the seventh lesson is the one written in the contrast between two men's bodies. Leadership, in the crisis, is partly a matter of where you physically are. DeKalb, 59 years old, fought on foot in the center of his trapped men and took 11 wounds before he fell. Gates, at the first sign of collapse, rode 60 miles in the opposite direction. The Continentals held as long as the man who had walked beside them on the march stood among them, and the army's fate and its commander's fate diverged the instant he turned his horse north. Soldiers know where their general is. It changes what they are willing to endure. And there is a final lesson, larger than any of the tactical ones, that only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see the whole war. It is that a defeat, fully absorbed and honestly understood, can be worth more than a victory. Camden taught the American command a set of hard truths that no victory ever could have, about logistics, about the limits of militia, about the danger of hunting one decisive battle, and because the disaster was total enough to discredit the man who caused it, those truths actually changed who was in charge and how the war was fought. Nathanael Greene's entire Southern campaign reads like a point-by-point correction of Gates's errors, which is to say it reads like a syllabus written in the blood spilled at Camden. Organizations that survive their disasters tend to be the ones willing to look squarely at them rather than explain them away. It is why modern militaries dissect their failures more carefully than their successes, because the failure is where the real instruction lives. America lost an army at Camden. What it gained at that price was the understanding of how to win. We began with a number, and we end with it. 1,200 elite soldiers marched into South Carolina in the summer of 1780. 700 came back. Between those two numbers lies almost no enemy action at all, and that is the haunting thing about Camden. The British, on that field, were merely the instrument that completed a destruction already engineered from within. The army was starved on a road its own officers begged it to avoid. It was sickened by green corn and unripe peaches and a ration of molasses on the eve of battle. It was arranged by the book so that its weakest men stood before the enemy's strongest. and at the moment of crisis, it was abandoned by the man whose name was on the orders. The enemy that did the most to destroy the Grand Army wore the same uniform as the general who commanded it, and yet, out of that total ruin came everything that followed. The 700 who staggered into Hillsborough became the seed of Nathaniel Greene's army. The disaster that ended, Gates handed the South to the one commander who knew how to win it. The blood of the Maryland and Delaware lines, men who advanced when they could have run, who fought surrounded, who held while their giant of a general took 11 wounds and would not fall, bought, at a terrible price, the hard lesson that finally taught the American war effort how the Southern War had to be fought. The monument at Camden marks where DeKalb lies. The fields where 2,500 men threw down their muskets and ran are quiet farmland now, with nothing to say that they were ever anything else. But the lesson does not need a monument, because it does not stay in the 18th century. Feed your soldiers before you ask them to fight. Listen to the people who know the ground. Do not mistake a famous name for a sound plan, or a paper strength for a real one, or a respected rule for a reason to stop thinking. And when the line breaks, be found among your men and not 60 miles down the road on the fastest horse you own. 1,200 marched in, 700 came back. The difference between those two numbers was not written by the British. It was written, weeks before the first shot, by the decisions of one man who would not listen, and redeemed on the day itself by the men who paid for those decisions and stood their ground anyway. That is the whole of Camden, and it is why, nearly 2.5 centuries later, soldiers still study a battle that America lost.